January 17, 1945. A single American officer holds an order that will kill 5,000 innocent people in less than an hour. He has two choices: obey and become a mass murderer, or refuse and destroy his career. He chose disobedience. In this documentary, you'll witness the moment one man jammed the machinery of war to stop an atrocity, and how his refusal rewrote the rules of liberation itself. This is not about following orders. This is about knowing when to break them. Here's what you'll learn. 1. How Allied intelligence mistook a concentration camp for an enemy stronghold and ordered its destruction. 2. The moment Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks saw the coordinates and realized the system had gone mad. 3. The choice he made and the 5,000 lives hanging in the balance. This is the story of the American officer who saved thousands by refusing to obey. January 17, 1945. The Bavarian forest sleeps beneath a blanket of snow so thick it muffles even the wind. In the pre-dawn darkness, a single American Jeep idles at a crossroads outside the village of Riedenburg, its engine coughing white vapor into the frozen air. Inside, Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks sits motionless, a folded message from divisional headquarters clutched in his gloved hand. The paper trembles, not from cold but from the weight of what it commands. Around him, the pine trees stand like silent witnesses, their branches heavy with ice. Somewhere in the distance, the muted thunder of artillery rolls across the valley. Sparks closes his eyes. In 6 hours, if he follows orders, 5,000 souls will cease to exist. This is not a story about heroism born in a single moment of gunfire. It is a story about disobedience, the kind that shatters careers, defies logic, and rewrites the boundary between duty and conscience. In the winter of 1945, as the Third Reich convulsed in its final agony, the Allied advance into Germany had become a grinding machinery of liberation and destruction. Prisoner of war camps, labor facilities, and concentration camps dotted the landscape like festering wounds. Military doctrine was clear: advance rapidly, neutralize threats, avoid entanglements that slow momentum. The enemy was collapsing, but desperation made them unpredictable. Every delay cost Allied lives. Every diversion risked operational failure. And yet, in the fog of that brutal winter, one American officer would choose to stop, to turn away from orders, from doctrine, from the very logic of war, because sometimes the machinery of victory must be sabotaged to preserve the soul of what victory means. Felix Sparks was not a romantic. Born in 1917 in Miami, Arizona, the son of a mining camp family, he had clawed his way through law school before the war swept him into uniform. By January 1945, he commanded the 3rd Battalion, 157th Infantry Regiment of the 45th Infantry Division, a unit that had bled through Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, and southern France. His men called him hard but fair, a commander who spent munitions carefully and lives even more so. He had seen what war does to bodies and minds. He had signed letters to mothers explaining why their sons would not return. He had learned that orders, however precise on paper, become blurred and terrible things when filtered through smoke and fear and exhaustion. The army had taught him to obey. Experience had taught him when obedience becomes complicity. The order that arrived on that frozen January morning was classified as routine tactical intelligence. Reconnaissance had identified a large concentration of prisoners, exact composition unknown, held in a rail yard near Dachau, approximately 30 kilometers ahead of the division's forward line. The compound was lightly guarded, the enemy in disarray. Division command assessed it as a potential partisan assembly point, or a repositioning depot for SS units attempting to regroup. The directive was explicit: artillery strike followed by infantry sweep. Neutralize the site. Continue the advance. Do not divert main forces. Do not delay. The war would not wait for ambiguities. Sparks read the coordinates 3 times. Dachau. Even then, in January 1945, the name carried whispers. Rumors filtered through intelligence channels, through captured documents, through the fragmented testimony of refugees. Camps. Not prisoner of war camps for soldiers, but something else. Something the mind resisted naming. Official policy discouraged speculation. The mission was liberation of territory, not investigation of atrocities. That would come later after victory in the sterile language of tribunals. For now, the machinery of war demanded forward motion. The artillery batteries were already calculating trajectories. The shells were being loaded. But Felix Sparks had seen something 3 weeks earlier that haunted him still. During a patrol near Strasbourg, his men had stumbled upon a forced labor column. Skeletal figures in striped rags, shuffling westward ahead of the German retreat. They were not soldiers. They were barely recognizable as human beings. Sparks had ordered his medics to provide what aid they could, but most were beyond saving. One man, a French Jew who spoke broken English, had grabbed Sparks by the sleeve. "Dachau," he whispered. "They take us to Dachau. Thousands. You must go to Dachau." The man died before dawn. Sparks buried him beside the road and filed a report that vanished into the bureaucratic ether. But the name remained, lodged in his memory like shrapnel. Now that name stared back at him from a targeting order. The expected procedure was clean. American military doctrine in early 1945 reflected hard lessons learned across 2 theaters of war. Ambiguity was the enemy's weapon. Clarity and speed were the allies. Unidentified concentrations of personnel in contested zones were to be treated as hostile unless proven otherwise. The burden of proof lay with the unknown, not with American lives. This logic had saved countless soldiers from ambush, sabotage, and surprise attack. It was, by every conventional measure, sound reasoning. And yet Sparks understood with cold certainty that soundness of reasoning and rightness of action were not always the same thing. He had expected this war to be comprehensible. In 1942, as a freshly minted lieutenant, he had believed that enemies wore uniforms, battles had fronts, and orders descended from commanders who possessed a clearer view of the strategic whole. The enemy was fascism, brutal, expansionist, unambiguous. Victory meant destroying that enemy's capacity to wage war. Simple. Brutal, yes, but simple. What he had not expected was the grinding erosion of moral clarity that came with each mile deeper into Germany. The refugees clogging the roads. Neither soldier nor civilian in any meaningful sense. The hollow-eyed children scavenging in ruins. The villages that hung white sheets from windows, surrendering to an army they had been taught to fear as barbarians, only to weep with relief when American soldiers distributed rations instead of bullets. And beneath it all, the rumors. Persistent, monstrous rumors of camps where the machinery of death operated with industrial efficiency. Sparks had expected combat. He had not expected to become an arbiter of who deserved to live based on incomplete intelligence and time-sensitive orders. The historical record of that morning is fragmentary, reconstructed from post-war interviews and unit logs. What is certain is this: Sparks did not immediately comply. Instead, he ordered his driver to take him forward, toward the coordinates. Against explicit doctrine that battalion commanders should direct operations from command posts, not personally reconnoiter contested zones. He took a single radio man and 2 riflemen. He told his executive officer to delay artillery clearance, engine trouble with the communication jeep, atmospheric interference, any plausible technical excuse. He bought himself 3 hours. The road to Dachau wound through villages draped in the eerie quiet of a collapsing regime. White flags hung from farmhouses. A few civilians watched the jeep pass with expressions too exhausted for fear. Sparks noted the absence of military-age men, the scarcity of vehicles, the general air of abandonment. This was not territory preparing for a final stand. This was territory already defeated, waiting only for the formality of occupation. And yet divisional intelligence insisted on the artillery strike. Why? Momentum, doctrine, the grinding logic that every delay multiplied risk. They smelled Dachau before they saw it, a sickly sweetness carried on the wind, mingling with the acrid bite of coal smoke. Sparks had smelled death before, the cloying rot of bodies left too long in summer heat, the chemical stench of burned flesh. This was different. This was death at scale, death as routine. The jeep crested a low hill, and the rail yard spread below them. Even from a distance, even through the morning haze, the truth was undeniable. Thousands of figures crowded behind barbed wire. Thousands. Not soldiers in formation, not partisans preparing ambush, but a mass of humanity pressed together for warmth, swaying slightly like wheat in wind. They wore striped uniforms. Their heads were shaved. Even at 200 meters, Sparks could see the geometry of ribs, the skeletal prominence of joints. Guard towers stood unmanned. The gates hung open. The SS had fled in the night, leaving their prisoners locked in boxcars and open pens, abandoned to whatever fate the approaching Americans would decree. Sparks raised his binoculars. He swept across the compound methodically, the way he had been trained. Assess threat, identify weapons, count enemy personnel. But the categories dissolved. Where was the threat? The figures behind the wire could barely stand. Where were the weapons? He saw none. Where was the enemy? The guards had vanished, leaving only their victims. And 5,000 victims were 20 minutes from an artillery barrage ordered by men who had never smelled this smell, never seen this sight, who were applying perfectly logical rules to a situation that defied logic. The radio man whispered, "Sir, Division is asking for confirmation. Fire mission is ready." Felix Sparks had spent 3 years learning to trust the chain of command. He had seen brilliant strategies save thousands of lives. He had seen coordinated operations achieve objectives that individual initiative would have bungled. The military was not a democracy. It was a machine, and machines required each component to perform its designated function. To disobey was not merely to risk court-martial. It was to inject chaos into a system that protected everyone through discipline and cohesion. And yet he also understood that the chain of command extended upward from men like him, that orders were only as good as the information on which they were based, and that the information Division possessed was catastrophically wrong. He could report what he saw. Transmit the truth up the chain. Wait for revised orders. But that would take hours. The artillery was ready now. Another unit might already be assigned. By the time bureaucracy processed reality, the shells might already be in the air. He knew how these things worked. Momentum had its own logic. Someone at Division had approved this strike based on reasonable assumptions. To reverse it would require that person to admit error, to accept that 5,000 lives had nearly been obliterated due to flawed intelligence. Institutions resisted such admissions. They moved slowly, and 5,000 people had no time. What Sparks experienced in that moment was not courage. It was something colder and more frightening. Absolute clarity. The machinery of war, efficient and necessary though it was, had produced an outcome so monstrous that stopping it required sabotage. He was not a hero choosing valor. He was a cog jamming itself into gears to prevent catastrophe. And he understood with a certainty that tasted like metal in his mouth, that this decision would define him more completely than any medal, any commendation, any moment of battlefield valor. He keyed the radio. Sparks to Sabre Command. Cancel fire mission. Repeat, cancel fire mission. Coordinates contain displaced persons, not enemy personnel. Proceeding with ground reconnaissance, there was a pause. Then, confirm? Ground reconnaissance not authorized. Fire mission cleared at Division level. Explain delay. Contact with civilian concentration. Concentration camp prisoners, thousands, not hostiles. Another pause, longer. Then a different voice, higher rank, sharper tone. Sparks, your orders are to neutralize the target and advance. We don't have assets for refugee processing. Air reconnaissance indicated possible enemy activity. You are to complete mission and proceed to phase line. Negative. These are concentration camp prisoners. They are not enemy personnel. I am assuming command authority for this sector and refusing the fire mission." The radio crackled with something that might have been anger or might have been disbelief. "Colonel Sparks, you are explicitly refusing a direct order?" "That is correct." Silence. "Then, remain on site. Division commander will address this personally. Do not advance. Do not engage. Wait for orders." Sparks handed the radio back to the signalman. He felt nothing, no relief, no fear, no triumph. Only a strange emptiness, as though something essential had been burned out of him. His career was likely over. The division commander would have no choice but to relieve him, possibly court-martial him. Refusing a direct order in combat was among the gravest offenses in military law. The fact that he had been right would matter only if the prisoners survived to testify. If they died anyway, disease, starvation, the chaos of the front's advance, then he would have sacrificed his career for nothing. But that calculus no longer mattered. He had seen what lay in the rail yard. He could not unsee it, and he would not be the man who allowed artillery to fall on it. The factual record shows that over the next 4 hours, a cascade of communication rippled through the Allied command structure. Sparks' refusal forced a halt to the fire mission, while senior officers assessed the situation. A reconnaissance plane was diverted, providing aerial photographs that confirmed Sparks's report. The site was indeed a concentration camp annex, crammed with prisoners too weak to pose any military threat. Intelligence officers scrambled to understand how the targeting had been approved. The explanation, when it emerged, was grimly banal. Aerial reconnaissance had noted the large concentration of personnel and the rail infrastructure. Standard doctrine classified such sites as potential logistics hubs or troop assembly points. No one had cross-referenced the location with fragmentary intelligence about Nazi camp systems. No one had considered that the enemy might abandon prisoners rather than evacuate them. The machinery had functioned exactly as designed, and had nearly produced an atrocity. By noon, advance elements of the 45th Infantry Division rolled into the Dachau annex. Medics moved among the prisoners, distributing rations and water, though many were too weak to eat. Sparks walked through the compound in silence. The prisoners, Polish, Soviet, French, Czech, Jewish, political criminal by Nazi classification, innocent in any moral sense, stared at the Americans with expressions beyond hope or fear. They had survived Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz-Birkenau, a dozen lesser camps. They had endured starvation, disease, forced labor, casual murder. They had been transported west as the Soviets advanced east, shuffled like cargo through the disintegrating infrastructure of the Reich. And now they stood in the January cold, alive because one American officer had jammed the machinery at the precise moment necessary. One prisoner, a French physician named Dr. Henri Bouchard, later wrote in his memoir, "We heard the American engines and prepared to die. We had been bombed by allies before. Such things happen in war, and we were nothing less than nothing to anyone's plans." Then a tall officer walked through the gate, and we saw in his face such horror, such recognition that we understood. He saw us as human, not as inconveniences, not as statistics. We lived because for one moment someone chose to see. The transformation in Felix Sparks was not dramatic. He did not collapse in tears. He did not give speeches. He ordered his men to secure the camp, coordinate with medical units, begin the grim process of documenting what they had found. He filed reports in the dry language of military bureaucracy, but those who knew him noted a change, a heaviness in his movements, a reluctance to meet the eyes of his soldiers. He had seen the abyss, not the abstract horror of Nazi ideology, but the concrete machinery of it. He had seen what systems, perfectly logical in their own terms, could produce when detached from moral consequence. And he had learned that sometimes the only moral act is to break the system. The symbolic weight of this moment extends beyond the 5,000 lives preserved. In the winter of 1945, American forces were liberating camps across Germany at a rate that overwhelmed their capacity to process, to comprehend, to respond. Commanders faced impossible choices: divert resources to camp survivors and slow the advance, potentially extending the war and costing Allied lives, or maintain momentum and leave survivors to ad hoc aid, potentially allowing thousands to die from neglect. The machinery of war had no protocol for this. Victory was defined by territory captured, enemies defeated, strategic objectives achieved. The camps were a moral complication, acknowledged in principle but deferred in practice. Sparks's disobedience forced the machinery to pause. His refusal, transmitted up the chain of command, reached General Eisenhower's headquarters within 24 hours. Eisenhower, confronted with evidence that Allied operations had nearly resulted in a massacre of concentration camp survivors, issued explicit orders. All suspected campsites were to be investigated before any fire missions. Resources were allocated for prisoner processing. Publicity protocols were established: photographers, journalists, documentation teams. The liberation of Dachau main camp, which occurred weeks later, became one of the most thoroughly documented moments of the war, precisely because Sparks' disobedience had alerted command to the stakes. But this symbolic weight came with a cost. Sparks was not court-martialed, but neither was he commended. His refusal had embarrassed division command, revealed flaws in intelligence processing, forced senior officers to confront the inadequacy of their procedures. The official record lists him as present at Dachau's liberation, nothing more. He received no medal for saving 5,000 lives. The machinery, even when corrected, resisted acknowledging that correction had been necessary. Among the prisoners Sparks saved was a young Polish chemist named Stanisław Kozłowski. Before the war, Kozłowski had studied in Berlin, drawn by Germany's reputation for scientific excellence. He had admired German culture, the music, the philosophy, the technological innovation. The camps had educated him differently. In the Dachau annex, starving and typhus-ridden, he had prepared to die with a strange absence of bitterness. The world was what it was. Evil had proven stronger than good. Then American soldiers had walked through the gates, and one of them, a tall officer with exhausted eyes, had stood in the compound's center and wept. Kozłowski survived. He emigrated to America, rebuilt his career, raised children who never went hungry. In a 1982 interview, he reflected, "I thought I understood civilization. I had studied in universities, read great books, believed in human progress. The camps taught me that civilization is not inherited. It is not guaranteed by technology or education or cultural achievement. It is remade or lost in the specific decisions of specific people at specific moments." That American officer, I never learned his name until after the war, he remade civilization. Not by building something, by refusing to destroy. The recurring symbol in this story is not a weapon or a ration, but a decision, or rather, the act of hesitation that precedes decision. In January 1945, the Allied war machine operated at a tempo that discouraged hesitation. Orders descended, units executed, the front advanced. This was necessary. This was how wars were won. But Sparks hesitated. He read coordinates and thought, this requires verification. He saw targets and thought, this requires sight. He received orders and thought, this requires conscience. That hesitation, that brief jamming of the gears, created space for 5,000 lives to continue. American abundance in this context is not material. The United States did not save those prisoners with wealth or technology. The 45th Infantry Division had no special equipment for processing concentration camp survivors. What Sparks represented, what America at its best represented, was a different kind of abundance. The luxury of questioning. The luxury of saying, the machine has produced an immoral outcome and I will stop the machine. Authoritarian systems eliminate that luxury. They demand obedience, punish doubt, equate hesitation with betrayal. They create efficiencies, terrible, monstrous efficiencies by removing the friction of individual conscience. The Nazi regime had operated its camps with brutal efficiency, precisely because no one within the system possessed the authority to stop and ask, "Is this right?" Sparks possessed that authority only because the American military system, for all its emphasis on discipline and hierarchy, retained a space for it. His disobedience was punishable, but it was not unthinkable. The system bent rather than broke. It investigated rather than executed. And in bending, in investigating, it preserved not only 5,000 lives but its own claim to represent something more than mere power. The epilogue of Felix Sparks' story resists easy redemption. He was not destroyed by his disobedience, but neither was he celebrated. He remained in the army, served in Korea, retired as a brigadier general. He practiced law in Colorado, raised a family, spoke rarely of the war. When he did speak, usually to students or historians, he resisted the label of hero. "I did what any decent person would do," he insisted. But the historical record suggests otherwise. Hundreds of Allied officers faced similar situations in early 1945. Ambiguous targets, time-sensitive orders, incomplete intelligence. Most followed protocol. Most trusted the machinery. Felix Sparks did not, and 5,000 people lived who would otherwise have died. In his final interview before his death in 2007, Sparks reflected, "People ask me if I was afraid of court-martial. I wasn't. I was afraid of the alternative. I was afraid of becoming the kind of man who could follow that order. There are moments when the system demands something of you that you cannot give and remain yourself. I chose to remain myself. Everything else was consequence." The 5,000 prisoners liberated from the Dachau Annex in January 1945 dispersed across the globe. Some returned to homelands that no longer wanted them. Some built new lives in America, Israel, Australia. Some died of disease and trauma before year's end. But they died human, not as collateral in an artillery strike, not as a tactical complication eliminated for operational efficiency. They died with names, or they lived with names. And that difference, the recognition that each was a someone rather than a something, was the gift of one man's disobedience. The larger truth this story illuminates is uncomfortable. Systems, even good systems designed by moral people for just purposes, will inevitably produce immoral outcomes. The machinery of war, the machinery of bureaucracy, the machinery of any large organization, operates by abstraction. It transforms individuals into units, decisions into procedures, moral questions into tactical calculations. This is necessary. Complexity requires simplification. But simplification has a cost, and that cost is borne by those who become abstractions. Freedom, in the deepest sense, is the capacity to resist abstraction, to look at coordinates and see souls, to question orders and imagine consequences, to jam the machinery when the machinery has gone mad. This is not anarchy. Sparks did not reject military discipline or command structure. He rejected the specific application of that structure in a specific instance, when it had become detached from its moral foundation. His disobedience was an act of loyalty to the values the system ostensibly served. This is the lesson carved from that frozen January morning. Institutions exist to serve human dignity, not the reverse. When institutions demand the sacrifice of dignity for their own perpetuation or efficiency, they forfeit their claim to obedience. Felix Sparks understood this intuitively, not as philosophy but as visceral truth. He saw the prisoners in the rail yard and recognized them not as complications to be managed, but as the very reason armies exist. Wars are fought, and orders are issued. They were what all the machinery was supposed to protect. In the end, the story of the American officer who disobeyed orders and saved 5,000 lives is not a story about exceptionalism. It is a story about the terrifying responsibility that comes with authority. Every officer, every official, every person with power to execute orders will face a moment when the system demands complicity with evil. Most will comply. not from cowardice but from the reasonable belief that the system knows better, that their limited view cannot encompass the whole strategic picture, that disobedience risks chaos. Felix Sparks faced that moment and chose chaos. He chose the risk of being wrong, the certainty of career damage, the weight of defying everyone above him in the chain of command, because the alternative was to become an executioner. The prisoners never forgot. They carried his name, those who learned it, like a talisman. They told their children in the darkest moment when all seemed lost, one man said no. One man stopped the machine. And because of that, we are here. You are here. The world continued. That is not heroism. That is something rarer and more essential. It is the refusal to participate in atrocity, even when atrocity arrives wrapped in the respectable language of military necessity. It is the recognition that some orders, however lawful their origin, must be disobeyed if humanity is to mean anything at all. Felix Sparks died at 90 years old, in a quiet room far from the frozen Bavarian forests where he made his choice. The machinery of the world continued without him, as it always does. But 5,000 lives continued too, spreading forward through time. Children, grandchildren, the uncountable ripples of existence. The camps had tried to erase them, to reduce them to ash and silence. An artillery barrage would have finished the work. Instead, they lived. They testified. They remembered. And somewhere in that remembering, in the preservation of those 5,000 threads of human story, is the true victory of the Second World War. Not the defeat of armies, but the refusal at crucial moments to let the machinery of death have the final word. 5,000 people lived because one man said no, not with a weapon, not with a speech, but with a single act of moral disobedience that stopped the machinery of death. 1 second before it was too late. Some orders must be broken. Some systems must be sabotaged. Some victories are won by refusing to fight. If you believe history this powerful deserves to be remembered, subscribe. Leave a comment with the name of an untold story you want us to uncover. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, because the greatest act of loyalty is knowing when to disobey.